just want to say a few words about the latter part of this reading, this fascinating discussion that Socrates has with his new character, Anytus. It may help to imagine who he is. Socrates has been talking with Meno, who is a young man. He's not an Athenian. Takes place in the great city of Athens. He is from a more provincial place in the northern Greece, Thessaly, where people might think of Athens as the center of Greek culture and knowledge. Although Meno is a wealthy man, he's not an Athenian, and he has sort of maybe come to Athens either to learn or to show off what he thinks he has learned. Whereas Anytus is an Athenian. Anytus is a fairly prominent man in Athens, well known in the community, and an older man, I would say. And so when Socrates is talking to him, maybe there's a sort of a different tone or a different value to things. I don't know, but it's quite interesting. I do think it's fascinating, this conversation that he has with Anytus, because they've been talking about whether virtue is teachable, and they have decided on hypothesis that if it's knowledge, then it'll be teachable. And then they've found some reasons to think that it is knowledge, that virtue is a kind of knowledge. But then Socrates has pointed out that he doesn't think there are any teachers of it. That is, if it's knowledge, then it's teachable. And if it's teachable, then there should be teachers of it. Now, whether that actually follows that inference that if it's teachable, then there will be teachers of it, I don't know if that's really valid inference. But Socrates says, well, maybe Anytus can help us. That is, I don't know any teachers of virtue, but maybe he does. And so he begins to question him. And by the end of it, Anytus is angry, and it's interesting to see how that happens. Right? Socrates says, well, I mean, if you were going to learn how to, play tennis, wouldn't you go to a great tennis player? And if you were going to learn how to speak German, you would go to somebody who knows how to speak German. So if you were trying to become virtuous, to become a good person, who would you go to? And Socrates says, aren't there people who do this? That is, people. If you want to learn German, you go to a professional German teacher. If you want to learn how to play tennis, you go to a professional tennis instructor. And there are people in Greece who profess to be able to teach virtue, and these are these people mentioned at the top of page 5, the sophists. Now that would lead us into a very interesting but maybe long discussion. Who are these people, the sophists? He mentions one, Protagoras, who is a very well-respected, very prominent man in Greece in the time of Socrates. I think he's already passed on. He's older than Socrates. Who were these people, the sophists? These were people who, some of them traveled from city to city, charging money to the young men of the city to teach them what? Some would say to teach them how to be virtuous. Some would say just to teach them how to speak, how to make a speech in public. But they were people who traveled. They were traveling teachers, and to be a sophist comes from the Greek word sophia, meaning wisdom. So, literally, a sophist was just a wise man, a teacher. And one of the really interesting questions, if you get into reading Plato, was Socrates, in essence, a sophist or not? And if he was not a sophist, how did he differ from the sophists? Obviously, Socrates, from the beginning of this dialogue, saying that he does not know what virtue is, that would seem to differentiate him from somebody who professes to know things and to be able to teach them, and therefore to justify charging money for the teaching. But Socrates says, well, there are these people called the sophists. If you wanted to learn how to be virtuous, then wouldn't you go to them just as you would go to a professional German teacher to learn German, or professional car mechanic to learn how to fix cars? And Anidas says, well, oh, no, these guys are terrible, these sophists. They don't help the young man, they harm them. And Socrates kind of in his gentle way, obviously, more irony, making fun of him. And because it doesn't seem as Anidas really knows what these people profess to teach, so how can he really know that they don't know what virtue is, right? But he asks him a very interesting question on page 6. He says, well, if you don't think these sophists can make people better by teaching them to be virtuous, then who would you say can make people virtuous? And Anidas says, well, this is on page 6, well, why single out individuals? Any Athenian gentleman, taken at random, if he will mind him, will do far more good to him than the sophists. Basically saying, well, who can teach virtue? Well, any respectable member of the community can teach virtue. You don't have to, teaching someone to be a good person, it's not a special knowledge. Any respected member of society can do it. Which is an interesting answer, right? Because it's a very conservative answer in a sense. Well, the way we do things, the customs of our community are right, and anybody who picks them up will be okay. And Socrates is maybe challenging that to some extent, but he goes on to say, well, you say that any Athenian gentleman can pass on virtue, can teach virtue, and then he gives them all these examples of these great Athenians who failed to pass on virtue to their own sons. He mentions Themistocles and Pericles and Thucydides, who I think were all either statesmen or generals in recent Athenian history, and all of whom were just widely considered to be virtuous men, to be great men, but whose sons were not. And one of the things Socrates points out, well, if these guys really knew what virtue is and could teach it, you would think that they would make sure to teach it to their sons, but somehow they failed. And Anidas has to admit that the sons of these great men are not virtuous themselves, not excellent themselves. So Socrates is true. You see what he's trying to do is saying, well, if virtue really is teachable, you would think that these guys would have taught it to their sons, but they didn't, which throws a great doubt on whether virtue is teachable and great doubt on whether virtue is knowledge. But in a more personal sense, or maybe even political sense, Socrates has just called into question these recognized great men of Athens, and by the end of it, Anidas is clearly upset. And the thing that he says at the end is almost a threat to Socrates.